Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast by Bangalore International Centre, bringing you conversations that move, inform, and encourage discourse.
Foreign policy today is also aimed at the domestic audience to a much greater extent than it used to be in the past. It's part of the democratization of foreign policy, I suppose. Also, social media, technology has changed. Otherwise, foreign policy used to be the private business of a small little establishment that did it in secret and was very proud of themselves and, got away with it. But that's no longer possible. And so now actually politicians use foreign policy to consolidate the base, to play to their followers' prejudices and so on. And therefore you get this much more assertive expression of foreign policy and a lot more talking about, look what we're doing, look at me, look at me.
Over the last decade, the world has seen the politicization of interstate relations, a rekindling of great power rivalries, pushback against globalisation, and an increasingly ineffective global order in terms of dealing with major challenges, such as pandemics, economic slowdowns, and wars. The world seems adrift, in between orders, and faces a real prospect of economic recession and a debt crisis in the global south. This episode of BIC Talks focuses not on a diagnosis of the issues and problems, which are many, but on prescriptions for how countries, nations, and firms might cope with rising uncertainty and higher geopolitical risk in the international system. It will also cover where the multiple revolutions in technology, energy, and military affairs may be taking us. This discussion features a panel with visiting Professor Ashoka University Shivshankar Menon, co-founder Takshashila Institution Nitin Pai, and co-chair Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace Latha Reddy. And now, over to Latha.
Are we really in an anarchic world today? And what do you see as the main issues that have led us to this point? I'll start with Mr. Menon.
Yes, I think we are in a world which is between orders and adrift. Anarchic only in the sense that there isn't a set order of things or there isn't agreement on the structuring of the international system. Because frankly, this is a normal world. Any international system based on nation states is going to involve great power rivalry. We got used to an exceptional sort of 20 years when the US was the sole superpower after the end of the Cold War. Otherwise, if you think back, there hasn't been a time when there hasn't been great power rivalry or contention for hegemony, for dominance. So in some ways, we've gone back to the old business of politics between nation states. But why do I say it's between orders? The last time we mounted a coherent international response to anything was the global financial crisis, 2008. 2009 in London, the G20 met, and they prevented a Great Depression again. They managed to do things to stabilize the international banking system. But after that, every big international crisis, transnational issue, climate change, pandemic, whether it was Ebola or whether now it's COVID, you look at the developing country debt crisis. The IMF says 53 developing countries are at grave risk of defaulting on their debt. And we've been saying this for the last 5 years in the G20 and everywhere, but nobody's done anything about it. If you look at the big issues, the world economy is slowed down, you look at what's happening on world trade, we are so thrilled when the WTO ministerial manages to do things that don't do anything for world trade. They don't open markets, but we're so happy that they managed to produce a communique. That's how sad it is, actually. So for me, there is no international order which is operating today. And that's why I say we're between orders. And every single great power today is revisionist. Nobody's happy with what there is. Normally, you have at least one or two status quo powers, right, who want to stay where they are, who think they're running things. And for most of our lives, at least, we've got used to a dominant Western US-led system, both economically and politically, and in terms of providing security. But today, the US talks of building back better. Better means what? Means you don't like what's going on now. And the US, there are grave questions about the US's ability to actually project power or engage because they have their own problems at home, as we all know. You reduce the question to its absurd limit is to say, what happens if Trump comes back in 24? I don't think that's going to happen, but maybe a Trump-like figure or something. But the fact that we ask the question itself suggests to you the level of uncertainty and the absence of anybody who thinks it's their system and has a stake in running it. And you can see the other great powers, China, Russia, clearly don't want the system. In fact, they just said so. In Uzbekistan, when they met Putin and Xi, said, we will be great powers and show that we won't accept orders where other people tell us the rules. And we are going to show how responsible powers should behave. But there's no alternative that they've actually suggested. So we don't know where we're going. We don't have a system that works. And we have huge issues. So that's why I think we're in a world adrift, as it were.
Nitin, over to you.
If I have to frame an answer to your question, I think we are in an age of anxiety. The anxiety comes from four broad directions, four broad trends. The first, as Ambassador Menon mentioned, is geopolitical. If you look at the last 20 years, the post-World War II order was already fraying because you didn't allow emerging powers into the decision-making tables early enough. And you ended up with the P5 dominating it long beyond their sell-by date. Then you had China, which was really a thumping power, very conscious of its civilizational identity, very conscious of its own view of what international relations should be, rising very fast and not adequately managed by the rest. And now you are in a situation where there's as Ambassador Menon put, it's adrift, there's a state of flux, things are up in the air. We don't know how the cards are going to land and how the new order will look like. So we don't have a foreign policy problem, we have a world order problem. That's what we've got to solve. That's number one. The second is, if you look at the geo-economic thing, which is linked to the geopolitical, but is important enough to be isolated out, is that we had a pattern, we had a playbook of geo-economics, which meant that you do liberalization at home, you do greater trade with everybody else in the world on a multilateral basis. And because this conforms to trade theory and how trade works, it was prosperity for everyone. Almost everybody in the last 20 years, every country in the last 20 years became more prosperous, some more than the others, some unfairly, China being your classic example, which was an asymmetric globalization for China, where China benefited from other people opening up, but China's own opening up was very selective, very strategic. But even so, there was a playbook which said, okay, we open up, it's going to be good for us. But now you are in a situation where it's still good for us to open up, but then there are political forces which tell you that you should not have free trade, you should have import tariffs, you should block, you should do things at home and all of that. Despite many of us knowing what happens in a situation where an economy, closed economy, what kind of products and services it gives you, we are still heading back into that kind of thing, not just in India, but around the world. That's number two. Number three is politics of the information age. Now, that's the big difference as compared to anything else we've seen in the past. In a matter of 25, 30 years, we've moved from the industrial age to the information age, which has created its own kind of politics. And these are the kind of politics which we viscerally feel and which trouble us on a daily basis, right? First is radically networked societies. People were able to mobilize online, engage in acts of terrorism, engage in acts of protests, engage in acts of all kinds of political mobilization that was earlier not easily doable, but something which the states and societies couldn't manage because they had no idiom for it, they didn't have machinery for it. Second, we have polarization on account of social media, where just the fact that the way the human brain reacts to information which comes 24/7 from a device in your pocket, it creates polarization. It creates ideological extremism. It creates identity-based politics. And it's not a surprise that around the world you have similar politics. The United States or India or China, Singapore, all of these countries seem to suffer from similar kinds of politics, right, in society. And the last is this business of information warfare, whether it's cyber warfare, which is the hacking of machines, or cognitive warfare, which is the hacking of minds. This is going on. This is entirely new, and we have no mental models to deal with this. So that causes anxiety. And the fourth area which is giving us anxiety is things like climate change. And the response to it and the perceived responses to climate change creates levels of anxiety. You know, some people think that it doesn't exist and people are doing too much and they're anxious. Other people think that this is way too serious and, you know, we're going to, in the next 50 years, humanity will cease to exist and we're doing things too slow and they're anxious. There are other people who think that there are two types of people who are anxious and they're anxious about that, right? So it's layers of anxiety. So now when all of these four sources of anxiety come together, you feel not just that the world is adrift, but we as individuals are adrift in this world, and we don't know how to, what kind of decisions we ought to make. And that creates certain kinds of, psychologies which prefer certain kinds of politics. We'll talk about it later. But I think this is where I want to end.
I like the model you've described, Nitin, and you're right. We all feel a certain amount of anxiety. But to get back to the SCO or Shanghai Cooperation Agreement, because, we all diplomats have a bad habit of talking in alphabet soups. There are so many acronyms. The SCO summit with our PM's participation is taking place in Samarkand today. He reached yesterday and it's still ongoing. A grouping of India, China, Russia, Pakistan, and Iran, which will be joining this year, as well as Turkey, which is a guest state, may seem an odd choice for India. So Asni Haider had brought on an article where she talked about India being all aligned, meaning aligned to all groupings. And perhaps that's true because we belong to SCO, BIMSTEC, BRICS, G20, the Quad, East Asia Summit, ASEM. Sorry, I'm going into the alphabet soup again. But is this all alignment? Is this multi-alignment? Is this strategic autonomy? What is it? And I'll put that question specifically with reference to the SCO to Ambassador Menon.
I think it's hard to find one word which describes what you're doing. When you see chaos around you, you end up reacting to situations and you end up also being opportunist, frankly. I mean, what you do today doesn't have to be coherent with what you're doing tomorrow or what you did yesterday. And in effect, that's what this world adrift, this world between orders, has forced many countries to do. It was possible in the 50s to say India is non-aligned, and you knew what non-alignment meant. Or when Vajpayee said strategic autonomy, you knew what it meant. But you were dealing with a structured, ordered world. Today, you're not. So I'm very nervous to put a label on it. But why are we in SCO? There is a basis for this. The West is absent on the Eurasian landmass. Whether it's commercially, military, now they've pulled out of Afghanistan as well. They're just not there. We are the only member of the Quad who are both a continental and a maritime power. Quad is 3 islands because the US is an island in geopolitical terms. It has 2 of the world's biggest oceans and 2 harmless enemies. It can retreat when it wants to. It can interfere, offshore balance, as they call it. But we are the only ones who have a big continental problem. We have a land boundary dispute with China. We have to worry about what happens in Asia. And in order to manage that, who do you work with? You have to work with people who are there. Iran, Russia. Now, you might not like what's happening, Russia getting closer and closer. In fact, a China-Russia axis, which has been formed over the last few years. You might not like that. But the fact is you have to deal with that reality, or else you turn your back on Asia. But your future is here. This is your continent. You're a subcontinent. You're not a continent on your own. You're not an island who can run away from what's happening. And it affects your security every day. You've seen the consequences of what happens in Pakistan on your security. And you're an open subcontinent except for the Himalayas. And today, technology has made even the Himalayas a battleground. So ultimately, you will have to work with whatever's available. So there is a reason for your being in SCO. Now, you might say that this is not going to lead very far. These people are not natural allies of yours. Their interests differ. Maybe, but maybe there is some overlap. You need to do that Venn diagram, see which bits you can work on together. And there are things like counterterrorism. There are other things where, frankly, your big threats are within the SCO. Cybersecurity is a good example of that, where you have a lot of trouble with other people in the SCO. But there are things where you will work together. You might call this opportunistic, you might call it unprincipled, but that's the kind of world you're in. And I don't think you have much choice except to do this, to use each group the way you can, where you can, and further your interests in whichever way you can.
I'm really pained and disappointed that the Shanghai Cooperation Organization does not have North Korea, Myanmar in it. Then it would have been complete. Because it looks very incomplete, right? And that suddenly we see we are the odd man out in this outfit. No, but more seriously, BRICS, SCO, and the Belt and Road Forum, which we skipped out. I think these are the kind of forums which, to me, were engagements which we got in at a time when we thought being engaged is better than being not engaged. BRICS is this weird one where somebody found out that big economies with 8% growth rate, okay, put these guys together and you create BRICS. I mean, it's absolutely a absurd the worst way to form a international organization. SCO was really a Chinese Middle Kingdom effort at the first attempt to create a international bloc under Chinese leadership, bring people under Chinese leadership. And I don't think we ever accept Chinese leadership in Asia. I agree with Ambassador Menon in terms of our need to engage with the powers of Asia. But we could do this bilaterally. We probably do it. We get better results doing this bilaterally even now than with SCO. I'm not sure that the SCO is essential for this purpose. But what it does is it puts us in situations where our prime minister is in the league with all these wonderful guys. I really miss Kim Jong-un. I don't know whoever the Myanmar guy is. I don't like to see my prime minister in the company of these guys. I don't think we represent anything with those guys too. Not to mention the fact that we have a leading conflict with two of those guys. The other is, I don't think we've understood the costs of being in such places. The cost of being in SCO, for example, is this hurried arrangement in Ladakh. We had to create an artificial time. It says, the SCO, the leaders might want to meet. So the generals in the Indian army were put under pressure that, okay, sort out something by the time, do something so that the prime minister can meet. The prime minister can't go to SCO and meet these guys if there's conflict open up. So you have to show something. And that cost of that agreement, I'm not sure really makes sense given the broader India-China equation. So why did we do this? So I think there are costs to these kind of things. People can use words like all alignment. As an electrical engineer, it doesn't make sense to me. How can you be aligned to everything? No, it can't be done. I mean, I'm trying to think 2-3 dimensions. No, it's very hard. So we can use buzzwords like this to justify whatever we do. Maybe it sounds good. But I think that on a net basis, an SCO is a kind of a setup where we're better off not being a part of, just like how we avoided the Belt and Road Forum. And even now that you're in, I think a better way to deal with these things is to extract a price of our participation. Instead of paying entry fees, what price can we extract out of this? I don't think the Ladakh settlement is a price. I don't think it's a Chinese concession by any means. It's probably even Stevens or an Indian concession. It's not a Chinese concession. We haven't extracted a price for that participation. So what are we doing?
Well, that brings me to my next question, which is on China. How do we perceive the challenges from China's rise and increasing assertiveness? And how do we in India respond to this challenge? What should we be doing?
But before I come to that, I want to add to what Nitin actually said about the costs you're paying. Because you're paying two other broader strategic costs by being in SCO and part of BRICS and doing what you used to do in a different context. It might have made sense then. Because of your stand on Ukraine, because of being part of this, being in Vostok, for instance, in these Russian exercises, and then we said, no, but we didn't take part in the naval exercises off the Japanese coast. I heard a Japanese official saying, so if we participate in Pakistani military exercises, but don't take part in what they do in POK, how would you feel? And we are seeing signs, I think, where you can't have it every which way. You do end up, the US has just done a strategic materials initiative and didn't bother asking you. They did a Blue Pacific initiative. And strictly speaking, as part of Indo-Pacific Quad, you would expect to. You haven't been invited. These are subtle signs of trouble. They're not going to call you out in public because they do need you strategically and they do think you are useful because their primary contradiction is with China. But you need to rebalance. There's a whole host of organizations which I think in today's context probably don't make much sense for you. Why are we in the Commonwealth? So I think it's time to change what you did. We're back to Einstein's definition of madness. You're doing the same thing that you used to do and expecting the same result in a different situation. How does that work? So I think what Nitin says is right. It's time to actually fundamentally look at it and change it and say the world has changed. We're going to change. We don't have to be consistent in our foolishness forever. But on the China, and China is a big part of this, is central to this because this is our biggest challenge. And over the last 40 years, we have allowed, where we were roughly similar size economies, we were probably more integrated in the world economy than they were. Technological levels are also roughly similar. Now there's no comparison. Their economy is much bigger than ours. in terms of power, projection, what the Chinese can do. Chinese are global economic superpower. They're still only a regional military power. I mean, the US is the only power who can project military power across the world. But for us, that's no consolation because our periphery we actually share with the Chinese. And we are going to rub up against them. And we do have a difficult relationship with them. So dealing with the consequences of China's rise, first thing, we have to sort ourselves out. We have to start narrowing that gap in certain areas. It's not that you have to match China in every respect, but you have to at least maintain the effective balance on the border. If you don't do that, which you did for many years, you kept pace and you are now trying to catch up with the Chinese. But the reason they did what they did in 2020 and tried to change the situation on the ground and succeeded to a certain extent, maybe not to the extent they planned, was because they thought they had an opportunity. They thought the balance had shifted in their favor. So that's essential. You can do as much external balancing as you like, but other people are not going to fight your battles on the border. So I don't think that external balancing is the answer to your particular problem right now on the border. It is a broader answer. It's a broader answer to transforming India and making India strong and capable of dealing. And that's where you have a whole host of things you have to look at. Are you willing to engage economically with the rest of the world? When were your high growth years? When you were most open to the world? And you then at one stage you were growing at 10.5% per year. But you're now down back and you're saying 7%, but on what? On a base that was terrible the year before. We need to actually work with others to transform India. That's what it is. And if the Chinese see that happening and see the rest of the world taking you seriously, taking your future seriously, they will also behave differently. That's where, for me, the external balancing is important. You don't need to fight the Chinese everywhere. You cannot, and it's not worth it. But you have a whole set of opportunities today, I think, in order to actually step in and do something. The subcontinent is a huge opportunity. It's in crisis. 5 governments have changed in the last year, not all of them willingly. 3 countries are talking to the IMF about money. The Chinese can't do anything. The Sri Lankans have talked to them for 10 months, saying, please reschedule our debt. But the Chinese can't. They said, we'll refinance, meaning I'll give you another loan, so I'll add to your debt. But if they reschedule with Sri Lanka, they have to reschedule with the rest of BRI. That's almost $1 trillion. Because everybody else will come saying, what about us? So here you have a moment where you can actually use the crisis to integrate the subcontinent, build payment systems. After all, you've spent $3.8 billion this year on Sri Lanka, fuel, food, credits. Use it. Create stakes in the relationship with the other rest of the... For me, crisis is an opportunity. All the things we said about are wrong with the system, here's your opportunity. Go out and change the situation because there's space for you to operate. Pakistan. Why is the whole ceasefire with Pakistan holding for the last year when we renewed the 2003 ceasefire? Because Pakistan has other problems to worry about. She has no money, she's in political crisis, and she has to worry about the TTP, who are re-energized by the Taliban coming to power in Afghanistan. She's bombing the TTP in Afghanistan in the last few months. So the Pakistan army right now keeps the ceasefire. Frankly, things look chaotic, look terrible, but I think we need to use this opportunity to create levers and things which will change the Chinese perception of this inevitable gap growing between us. And the only way to do that, because the Chinese operate on the relative balance of power, and you can see it. They were faithful camp followers of the US until 2008, until the global financial crisis. Anything the US did was fine by them. They never got in the way. After 2008, suddenly they've grown ideas and they're busy asserting themselves in the neighborhood everywhere else. So it's the relative balance of power. And unless we address that, both immediately on the border as the effective balance, but also in the broader sense, and their perception of it, that's very important. If they see you as a divided country which is fighting itself, which is alienating 12% of its own population, they will treat you a certain way.
The first time I made this point was at the BIC in 2010. And that's got to do with a very simple thing that we are better off shifting the locus of the India-China rivalry from the Himalayas to the Pacific. Because if the rivalry plays out in the Himalayas, we find ourselves in very contentious, very tenuous, very dangerous grounds. Because let's say the Chinese were to walk in and take a village or two in Ladakh, and this plays out in the media, it puts the political leadership in a very tricky position. And the political leadership will have to react, invest more in fighting in the hills. When your armies are looking and touching each other, lots of things can happen. You don't want these kind of rivalries to play out where the armed forces are eye to eye or literally more than eye to eye. So shift this to the Pacific in various ways. You shift this in the economic domain. You shift this in the pure balance of power domain. You shift this even in the military domain, in the maritime domain. I think that's the opportunity which was there for the last 10 to 12 years. And now it's become even more interesting because of the intensification of the multiple military crises which China has created in the East Asian, anything east of the Straits of Malacca, whether it's in the South China Sea, whether it's in Taiwan Straits, whether it's off the coasts of Japan, or even in the Pacific itself. Now, this is risky. It's become much more risky now than it was 10 years ago in terms of sheer conflict breaking out between China and one of its adversaries there. But we don't have to participate in conflicts. We just have to be there, and we just have to signal our ability to shift the conflict in ways that are detrimental to one player or the other, whether it's the United States or whether it's China. Your presence and your action can change the calculation which the main players there have, and that gives us leverage. That also helps us deter the Chinese from doing funny things in the Himalayas. Because if you can signal to him that I can mess with you where it hurts you, then he's unlikely to mess with you where it hurts you. I think there's an opportunity now, but it's also a much more riskier time to avail of that opportunity.
I wanted to now go to another issue altogether, but one which is very, very topical and very much in all our minds. And that is, how do we see the conflict triggered by the Russian invasion into Ukraine heading? And how will it be resolved? I know it's not politically correct at the moment in India to talk about the invasion, but I do see it as an invasion. So, Ambassador Menon, you first.
I've never understood why we don't call it an invasion. It is an invasion. And it's a question of your own credibility, actually. And frankly, for me, the logical attitude right from the beginning, from February 24th, would have been an invasion is silly because it's not going to solve the problem. There's no military solution to this. So are economic sanctions because they're not going to solve the problem either. And there has to be a better way. And the best way is around a table where you reconcile your interests and you accommodate the legitimate interests that all sides have in this. But of course, those days are long gone. So what is it now? It's now a fight between Europeans for the European order. And there is no European order left, and they're both trying to create an order of their own. So whoever wins or loses, frankly, Europe is going to be in turmoil for a while. And even if nobody wins, that's the worst, of course, and many people think that's the most likely outcome. But let's say Russia wins. You think NATO and the US and the Ukrainians will let them live in peace? No. And if the Ukraine wins, you think an angry, revengeful Russia looking to actually overthrow whatever results is going to let Europe live in peace? So Europe is going to be preoccupied with Europe for a long time to come. I mean, all this talk of Europe is coming into the Indo-Pacific and so on. My worry is that the US will also continue to be distracted. I mean, they've been talking about rebalancing to the Asia-Pacific, then Indo-Pacific for the last 20 years. But they have never done it. Either Afghanistan, then Iraq, then something or the other, now Ukraine. So if you look at the actual commitment to the Indo-Pacific, it's limited. And they've managed to push the Russians into Chinese arms. You can blame whoever you want for this whole process because you can take it back to NATO membership or you can take it back further. You can take it to Russian actions have not been that sensible or productive. But whoever you want to blame, the net result is you now have a China-Russia axis. We have to worry at the rate they're going with Western sanctions. Russian weapons and platforms are going to have Chinese chips in them because there won't be any others available to the Russian. Is that what we want? And do we want to see Russia as a junior partner? Even if Russia is very reluctant and doesn't like the idea and has historical reasons to distrust it. But what options does Russia with a declining population? And ultimately, these sanctions are going to mean a declining economy as well. Might survive for today and tomorrow. But the consequences, apart from the second order consequences like high food prices, high energy prices, all of which are not very good for us. But apart from that, for me, the longer term political effects of what's happening are worrying for us. But there isn't much that we can do about this. It's interesting that Putin said in public to Xi Jinping that we understand your concerns and questions and will answer them tomorrow, meaning in the SEO meeting. So I actually think it's even worse for China than it is for us in many ways, because they've got themselves tied after declaring their partnership without limits on February 4th. I think they really have a problem. And frankly, for them, the land part of BRI, the goal was to reach Europe. I mean, how do they go without Ukraine, without Russia? They have one railway line which will find its way through Poland maybe. But BRI, I think it's knocked it for a six. Quite apart from the political pressure that now you have a united West, China seems to have lost Europe. They had a comprehensive agreement on investment trade, which has not been ratified, and after this is very unlikely to be. So there's a whole set of other consequences also, which for me, these are difficult. Now, for us, there's also opportunities. On the energy side, there's a remaking of the world. I mean, you might actually end up at the end of this with one global gas market, which you've never had, unlike oil. I don't know where it's going, but we are fishing in troubled waters. We're getting cheap oil from the Russians, and let's see. But that's tactical opportunism. The larger political, strategic consequences, I'm afraid, are not very good.
Nitin, you and I were at the Pune International Center where we discussed Russia and Ukraine in some detail. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Thanks, Latha. The first thing which comes to my mind is then when you don't have a dog in the fight, all you need to do is to ensure that you're on the winning side. It doesn't really matter who wins, but we should make sure that whenever this conflict comes to a certain kind of a end, we are on the side which is more advantageous, which has got the upper hand. One way to look at it is to see where your trading partners, your most important trading partners are, which side of the conflict they've taken. We did an analysis, and 90-something% of our trading partners, the way they've voted in the United Nations, are against the Russians. Calling it an invasion is just the smallest of those things. They've actually condemned it. So if you're looking at where our interests lie, because our trading partners are important to us, and in sanctions regimes, etc., especially when it goes to more complicated ones into technology, supply chains and all that, you just want to be in a place where you can trade with your partners. That's the winning side. And you have to make sure that you're on that side and you're not cut out of that, right? And that, I think, is a strategic objective we should be looking at beyond cheap oil. And as Ambassador Menon said, these are very tactical, opportunistic things that you do because you have that room to play and you make the best out of it. But if you look at where do we want to go, it's really to make sure that when this thing settles down, we are in a better position than if we are on the wrong side. The second thing which strikes me and impresses me about this conflict is what it means in the court of information warfare. Before the conflict, everybody was saying that the Russians have a formidable information warfare machine. There's this Gerasimov doctrine where they've integrated information warfare, propaganda, psychological operations, military operations together, and it's the best in the world and all of that. And a lot of us who studied this were sort of impressed by that. But the first thing which struck you is the fact that tanks had to move in to Ukraine implies that information warfare failed. Your propaganda couldn't win even people who are culturally very similar to you. The Ukrainians, more or less, they are in the same cultural space as the Russians. You couldn't impress the Ukrainians enough to join the Russians. So you had to send tanks. At that one level, it shows the limits of what a closed authoritarian state can do in terms of information warfare. Your limits of your soft power, your cultural power, do not even extend to your immediate neighbors, number one. The two is, if you look at what Ukraine did, it's almost got global sympathy and support. People who didn't know what Ukraine was on the map in the beginning of this year are flying Ukrainian flags on their rooftops, right? They have Ukrainian icons on their social media handles and so on. And how did this happen? And it's not just sympathy and publicity. It's also material support. The number of countries which have just come out of the blue and started providing military assistance, financial assistance, technical assistance, and all kinds of things, individuals also walking in and joining the Ukrainian struggle is just amazing. And this is for a bunch of people who are probably unknown to the rest of the world. I mean, most of the rest of the world before February 2022. So how did they pull that off? I think there are things to learn there. Now, for sure, the United States spent almost the whole of last year helping the Ukrainians prepare, both in the information domain, cyber domain, and in hard military domain. There's no doubt about that. The Europeans and the Americans have helped them a lot. But even so, how do you end up in a situation where you're the darling of the world, despite being so small? And how, if you're Russia, how do you end up in a situation where you're seen as the villain of the peace, at least in the public domain? So there are lessons to be learned. There's things you should do, things you should not do.
I want to bring in one other point, that I think the race question is very important here because, you saw the comments that came in when Ukraine was invaded, the outcry from the West, particularly from Europe and even from American commentators was, these are people like us, they're blonde and blue-eyed people who are fleeing as refugees. I mean, in a way, it's a deeply racist comment to say that somehow people who belong to the same race as the predominant numbers in Europe and US are entitled to better treatment as refugees than refugees from, let's say, our part of the world, or Syria or Iran or anywhere else. So I think that is an element which we have to keep in mind. Perhaps that's played a role in why they are the darling of the world.
I'm in no position to comment because if you look at intake of refugees, Europeans and Americans have taken a lot more refugees from around the world than we have.
True. That's
right?
true.
So
yeah.
I don't have a moral standing to comment on the Europeans because if you are racist after taking so many refugees, it's one thing. But if you just say, I'm not going to take refugees, that's entirely other, right? That's what we're doing.
You need to compare with how in 1971, despite the world's big propaganda machines being against us, we did manage to get world opinion on our side. 10 million refugees, the underdog, that image. I think that really works across the world.
Maybe the underdog question, you mean?
Yeah. I think there's a lot of military lessons to be learned. You don't get to eliminate 5 Russian generals unless your intelligence is perfect, that you can pinpoint where they are, unless they're stupid enough to use their mobile phones, which maybe they were. But you never know. But also, if I were Chinese, I'd be very worried. Look at the performance of conscript armies. I mean, it tells you something about if you have people for 3 years, short-term conscripts, how much can you train them? How much cohesion can you build into your units? How useful are they in this kind of warfare, where technology, where intelligence plays such a big role? It's a new kind of war, actually.
There's just one thing from the Pune thing which I want to add.
Yeah.
It's a point which was made by Ajay Shah, who's very sharp in terms of, I think he's the sharpest cookie when it comes to looking at the impact of these geoeconomy. What he says is this: after the war in Ukraine ends, there's so many things that are broken, right? I mean, we've literally destroyed so much of infrastructure in Ukraine. The Europeans will want to rebuild that. And you need close to $1 trillion, I can't remember the number, close to $1 trillion in real investment to rebuild Ukraine or the places that have been broken, which means a whole lot of global capital will go into financing Ukrainian rebuilding, which means the cost of capital for people like us will increase. Even if you want to build bridges and infrastructure, etc., the cost of capital will increase. So that's his analysis. I don't have the numbers, but I think that's something we have to be concerned about in a way that the second order effect of that crisis might translate into higher infrastructure costs, capital costs for us.
Yeah. Also, it's probably bought Taiwan another 5 years at least.
I want to talk now about India's foreign policy. Do you see a more assertive Indian foreign policy today? One commentator has talked about the saffronization of the Indian Foreign Service. I'd particularly like to hear your views on that. And what has this meant for India's international relations? And how does the West, especially the US, see us in this context, this new foreign policy?
I think we're certainly presenting ourselves as much more assertive. But that's partly because I think foreign policy today is also aimed at the domestic audience to a much greater extent than it used to be in the past. It's part of the democratization of foreign policy, I suppose. Also, social media, technology has changed. Otherwise, foreign policy used to be the private business of a small little establishment that did it in secret and was very proud of themselves and, got away with it. But that's no longer possible. And so now actually politicians use foreign policy to consolidate the base, to play to their followers' prejudices and so on. And therefore, you get this much more assertive expression of foreign policy and a lot more talking about, look what we're doing, look at me, look at me. Are we actually more adventurous in practice? You still have to convince me of that, because it seems to me that in actual fact, you've become pretty risk averse. Otherwise, you wouldn't be in the situation you're on in the border with China. You're not seizing opportunities that I see, as I said, in the neighborhood with Pakistan. And certainly you've run away from economic opportunities like RCEP, like the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, where you're saying, I won't do the trade leg. You're hedging both ways. You give with PLI and take away with higher tariffs. So one hand you're giving, the other hand you're taking. This, for me, is not an adventurous or the kind of policy changes that you need. You started down military reform, appointed a CDS, started talking of theaterization, jointness, and so on. But now 9 months, the last CDS passed on, and suddenly it's all seemed to have come to a stop. Accountancy seems to determine defense decisions rather than, objective needs. When I say foreign policy, for me, foreign policy is much broader than just diplomatic meetings and summit meetings of leaders. If foreign policy is the business of creating outcomes which serve your interests and furthering your interests, then I'm not sure that I'd say we are more assertive today or not. Whether you call it saffronization or whatever, I've always been against the idea that you politicize the making of foreign policy. And the professionals need to stay professional and give you honest advice. They need to tell you the bad news. That's the job. We're paid to tell the leaders the bad news. Privately, quietly, without embarrassing, saying, I told the old fool. But, you need to do this, but it needs to be done. And you need to protect people. If you get into a situation of groupthink, of saffronization, where leaders hear what they want to hear, and there's enough people in political system, in a bureaucracy, who are willing to tell leaders what they think they want to hear. But a good leader knows the difference and knows that he needs honest advice. And that's why the professionalization is important. I mean, whether they're saffronized or whether they're communist or Marxist or whatever, frankly, that's a personal choice of their own. But it shouldn't enter into their professional life because it affects your efficiency.
Nitin, thoughts on foreign policy and where it's going?
Assertiveness in style, I agree.
Yeah.
There is definitely an assertiveness, an attempt to show that you're assertive, you're on the front foot, you're ready to give as much as you get or even more than you get. So in terms of style and a combative kind of a style. In terms of substance, I would think there is assertiveness is in promoting or refloating the Quad as a countervailing coalition to China's rise. Maybe not to the extent that I would have liked. I don't think it's as powerful, as assertive as I would have wanted it to be. But okay, it's assertive relative to what my fears were. On the saffronization, I think any public official in a democracy is cut of the same cloth as the rest of the population. He or she will have the same prejudices, biases, aspirations, fears as anybody else. And to the extent that the UPSC has been largely successful in widening the base from which it picks people, you will see these characteristics in the government service as well, and even the armed forces. It's not that anybody is immune from that. That in itself is not so much a comment on the foreign service or the public services as much as comment on overall society as well. But I totally agree with Ambassador Menon on the professionalism. You could be left-wing, right-wing, Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck, really doesn't matter. As long as professionally you're doing what you're supposed to do and you're doing it to the best of your ability, you're being absolutely consistent with your responsibilities to the Constitution and your responsibilities to the political leadership in terms of giving them accurate feedback about what it is. Maybe sometimes it might help if you're a saffronized person and the political leadership has greater comfort with you because they see that politically you're on the same side. If you are a pro-BJP bureaucrat and you have the confidence of the Prime Minister and the leadership and you are able to be truthful and forthright, I think it's a good thing.
Well, that brings us to the conclusion. So I want to thank my two panelists for the wonderful exposition they've made on so many different subjects. And once again, come back to BIC for all our programs. Thank you.
thank you for staying on for the full conversation. If you liked what you heard, please share it with family and friends. You can also leave us a review on iTunes or Apple Podcasts. The crew that makes these podcasts possible are Gaurav Krishna and Ishan Gupta on sound supervision and production, with support from S. Sarvanaraj and Raghavendra Tenkaila. Artwork and design is by Chandani Venkataraman of Crisscross Design Studios. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org. Do follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter to get regular updates on our programming. This is Lekha Naidu signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.